20 white wolves circled a father's grave, and one alpha king came to repay a debt. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to Emily Carter. Emily stood at the edge of the old cemetery just before dawn, her breath fogging in the cold air as the forest held its silence like a held breath. And there they were, 20 white wolves forming a perfect circle around her father's grave, their coats pale as winter light, their bodies still, not snarling, not pacing, simply present, as if the ground itself had asked them to stand guard. She did not scream, did not run, because something in the way they watched the headstone felt less like a threat and more like a promise she did not yet understand. Thomas Carter had been laid to rest 3 years ago, with a simple marker and no crowd, just a daughter who stayed long after everyone else had left, smoothing the dirt with bare hands until it felt right. He had been a quiet man, the kind who fixed fences without being asked and returned lost dogs without expecting thanks, a man most people overlooked until he was gone. Emily had learned early how to live on the margins, working long hours at the feed store, counting every dollar, measuring time in bus routes and paydays, never in favors owed or names that carried weight. As she stepped closer, the wolves shifted only enough to make space, their eyes calm, their attention unwavering, and she felt the strange certainty that they were not there by chance. The headstone bore her father's name, the dates, nothing more, yet the air around it seemed fuller, as if memory itself had gathered. She remembered a night years ago when her father came home late, his jacket torn, his hands shaking from cold, saying only that he'd helped someone in the woods, and that sometimes you did the right thing even when no one would ever know. She had believed him then without question, the way daughters do. Now, with the wolves standing sentinel, that memory returned with a weight she could feel in her chest. From the treeline, a presence announced itself without sound, a tall man in a dark coat pausing at the edge of the clearing, the wolves acknowledging him with a subtle lowering of their heads, and Emily sensed the forest itself yielding an inch. He did not rush forward or raise his voice. He simply watched, taking in the grave, the circle, the woman who refused to look away. When he finally stepped into the light, the morning seemed to sharpen around him, and Emily understood, without anyone saying it, that this was the Alpha King, Alexander Blackwood, a name spoken rarely and never lightly. He stopped a few feet from the stone and inclined his head, a gesture of respect that felt earned rather than performed. "Thomas Carter," he said quietly, as if greeting an old friend, and the words settled over the clearing like a benediction. Emily's heart steadied, not with fear, but with recognition, as if the long arc of a story she hadn't known she was living had reached its first true beginning. And as the wolves held their circle, the Alpha King's gaze met hers, steady and intent, and she realized that whatever debt had been carried through the years had finally come home to be repaid. Emily did not remember how long she stood there after the Alpha King spoke her father's name, only that the cold no longer seemed to reach her bones, and the forest felt less like a place she had to survive and more like a place that had been waiting. Alexander Blackwood did not touch the headstone or step any closer than respect allowed, yet his presence changed the space, as if an invisible line had been drawn and everything inside it now mattered. He spoke of Thomas Carter with a calm certainty, not praising him, not exaggerating, simply stating truths that had never found an audience before. How a quiet man had chosen mercy on a night when it would have been easier to look away. How that choice had echoed farther than anyone could have imagined. Emily listened, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her worn coat, thinking of the life she had lived since her father passed, the mornings measured by alarm clocks and bus schedules, the evenings counted in small victories like paid bills and warm meals, the constant awareness of being unseen. She had learned to keep her head down because the world rarely rewarded those who did not demand attention, yet her father had lived differently, believing that dignity did not need witnesses to be real. When Alexander finally turned his attention fully to her, his gaze held neither pity nor expectation, only recognition, and that unsettled her more than fear ever could. He acknowledged her loss without softening it, speaking plainly of time and distance and the weight of keeping a promise longer than most lives lasted. And Emily realized that what stood before her was not a legend come to collect something owed, but a man honoring a debt, because he believed that was how power remained clean. The wolves remained still, their circle unbroken, as if they understood this moment belonged to words rather than movement. Alexander told her that the grave would no longer be alone, that it would be watched not because it was sacred ground, but because it marked a life that had mattered, and that those who respected such things would always find allies they did not expect. Emily nodded, unable to speak at first, the truth of it pressing behind her eyes, because for the first time since her father's death, she felt seen not as a burden or an afterthought, but as a continuation of something honorable. He did not make grand offers or dramatic vows. Instead, he offered something quieter and heavier, protection not as charity but as acknowledgment, a promise that the path ahead would not require her to become smaller to survive. As the light shifted and the day began in earnest, the wolves slowly stepped back, not scattering but easing away like a tide receding, leaving the grave as it had always been, simple and true, yet now surrounded by a memory that would not fade. Alexander inclined his head once more, a farewell that felt like a beginning, and told Emily that debts repaid did not close doors but open them, that her father's choice had woven her into a story larger than hardship. When he turned toward the forest, she felt the weight of his departure and the certainty of his return in equal measure, and as she knelt to brush frost from the stone, Emily Carter understood that her life had shifted not through spectacle or force, but through the steady gravity of a promise finally kept. Emily left the cemetery only when the sun had climbed high enough to thin the frost, carrying with her the quiet certainty that the past had reached forward and taken hold of the present. And as she walked the familiar path back toward town, memories surfaced with a clarity she had never allowed herself before, moments that had seemed ordinary until now. She remembered being 10 years old, sitting at the small kitchen table while her father brewed coffee that smelled stronger than usual, his hands unsteady as he wrapped them around the mug, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the window, as if the woods had followed him home. That night, he had come in later than expected, his jacket damp with melted snow, his boots tracked with mud from a place he rarely went, and when she asked where he had been, he had smiled the tired smile he saved for worries he did not want to pass on, and said he had met someone who needed help. He did not tell her much more, only that sometimes people crossed paths for reasons that did not announce themselves, and that doing the right thing did not always come with applause. In the days that followed, she noticed small things, how he moved more carefully, how he kept glancing toward the tree line when he thought no one was watching, how he refused the quiet curiosity of neighbors with gentle deflections, insisting it was nothing worth discussing. Emily had learned from him that restraint could be a form of courage, that privacy was not secrecy but respect for the weight of a moment. Years later, after he was gone, those lessons had kept her steady through lean months and long nights, shaping her into someone who endured rather than demanded. Now, with the Alpha King's words echoing in her thoughts, those memories aligned into a picture she could finally see, her father in the woods, kneeling beside a stranger, offering warmth and shelter without asking a name, choosing humanity over convenience. She understood then why Alexander Blackwood had spoken of keeping power clean, because her father had lived by the same principle without ever having power at all. Back at her small apartment, Emily set her coat over the chair and stared at the quiet room, noticing how even the hum of the refrigerator felt different, as if the space had expanded to make room for a truth she had carried unknowingly. She thought about the wolves standing watch, not as guards but as witnesses, and about how the Alpha King had looked at her, not to claim or command, but to acknowledge that she was part of a story shaped by choice rather than chance. Outside, the town moved as it always had, cars passing, doors opening and closing, people unaware that a balance had been restored just beyond their routines, and Emily felt no urge to explain or prove anything, because her father had taught her that meaning did not require permission. She brewed coffee the way he had, letting it steep a little longer, and sat by the window as morning settled in, understanding that the path ahead would not be free of hardship, but that it would be different now, marked by a promise kept and a debt repaid. And as she lifted the mug, she whispered a quiet thank you to a man who had believed that the smallest kindness could travel farther than any ambition, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe it too. The change did not announce itself with spectacle, but with whispers that moved faster than reason. And by the second day after the wolves vanished from the cemetery, Emily began to feel eyes on her back as she walked through town, glances that lingered a second too long, conversations that paused when she entered a room. At the feed store, where she stacked bags by weight and counted inventory in pounds and dollars, a coworker asked casually if she had been up near the old graveyard, saying someone had heard unusual stories, and Emily answered with the truth shaped by her father's example, neither confirming nor denying more than was necessary. By afternoon, the rumors had grown their own legs, stitched together from fear and fascination, about white shapes in the woods and a presence that did not belong to ordinary days. And Emily realized that what unsettled people most was not what they had seen, but what they could not explain. That evening, she returned to the cemetery with a thermos and a folded blanket, not because she believed the wolves would return, but because the ground there felt steadier than anywhere else. And as she approached, she noticed fresh tracks near the edge, not chaotic or careless, but measured, as if something had passed through with purpose. She knelt by the headstone and brushed away fallen leaves, her breath slow, reminding herself that fear often borrowed the shape of uncertainty, and that dignity did not require permission. A pair of men approached at a distance, stopping short of the grave, their voices low and cautious, speaking of property lines and safety, suggesting it might be best to discourage attention, and Emily stood, meeting them with a calm she did not know she possessed, telling them simply that her father was buried there and that the land had harmed no one. They hesitated, unsettled not by threat, but by her refusal to shrink, and after a moment they retreated, leaving behind the echo of their doubt. As dusk settled, the forest grew quiet in a way that felt deliberate, and Emily sensed that the circle drawn days earlier had not disappeared but widened, extending beyond stone and soil into something less visible and more enduring. On her walk home, headlights slowed as cars passed, drivers curious rather than hostile, and she thought of how easily attention could turn sharp if left unanchored by truth. That night, she sat by her window, the town's familiar sounds folding into the dark, and considered the Alpha King's words about promises that opened doors, understanding that the tension she felt was the weight of a threshold, the moment before a choice was tested. She did not know what form the protection he offered would take, only that it would demand something of her in return, not obedience but honesty, not silence but steadiness. When sleep came, it was shallow but untroubled, filled with images of paths through trees and figures who watched without malice. And when morning arrived, Emily woke with a resolve she had not named before, ready to hold her ground not because she had been chosen, but because she had always been worthy. And as the day began, she sensed that the world was adjusting, inch by careful inch, to the presence of a debt finally acknowledged and a woman who would not be moved. The confirmation came quietly, the way true things often did, when Emily noticed a dark sedan parked across the street from the feed store just before closing, its engine off, its windows catching the last light, and she understood without panic that she was being watched, not by curiosity alone, but by intent. She finished her shift, counted the register down to the dollar, and stepped outside into the cooling air, measuring her pace by habit, noticing how the car did not follow until she had gone half a block, then rolled forward at a respectful distance, neither hiding nor pressing. The sensation did not feel like danger. It felt like oversight, the steady presence of someone making sure the edges held. At the corner, the sedan slowed to a stop, and Alexander Blackwood stepped out as if he had been there all along, his posture easy, his attention focused on the street rather than on her at first, giving the moment space to be ordinary. When he finally looked at Emily, his expression held the same calm gravity she remembered from the cemetery, and he spoke her name once, clearly, without urgency, as if testing how it sounded in daylight. He told her he had stayed nearby to observe, not her alone but the way the town adjusted, how rumors either sharpened into harm or softened into understanding, and that he preferred to see which way a place leaned before deciding how to stand within it. Emily listened, aware of passers-by and open windows, appreciating that he chose words that would not turn heads, explaining that protection worked best when it blended into routine, when it made space for people to choose better rather than forcing them. He mentioned her father again, not as a saint, but as a standard, someone who had acted without spectacle, and he said that debts were not only repaid with guards or declarations, but with patience and witness. As they spoke, a pair of teenagers crossed the street laughing. A neighbor waved from a porch, and Emily realized that the presence she had felt was not meant to isolate her, but to anchor her, to ensure that ordinary life could continue without fear masquerading as concern. Alexander asked her what she wanted next, not as a command, but as a question weighted with respect, and she surprised herself by answering honestly, saying she wanted to keep her job, to tend her father's grave without interference, to live without being treated like a story people could tell however they liked. He nodded, accepting the list without amendment, and said that such requests were reasonable, which was another way of saying they would be honored. Before leaving, he told her that witnesses mattered, that he would be watching not to claim but to learn, and that when the time came to speak publicly, it would be because silence no longer served justice. As he returned to the car, the street seemed to exhale, and Emily walked the rest of the way home alone, her steps lighter than they had been in years, understanding that the circle had widened again, from wolves to roads to choices made in daylight. That night, as she prepared dinner and set aside a portion by habit she had never broken, she felt the steady reassurance of being seen without being consumed, and she knew that whatever came next would ask her to stand as she had always stood, quietly, firmly, with her name intact and her path her own. The moment that shifted everything arrived not with confrontation but with invitation, when a notice appeared on the community board outside the town hall announcing an open meeting about land use and preservation near the old cemetery, written in careful language that suggested order rather than alarm. Emily read it twice, understanding that this was how balance was tested, in rooms with folding chairs and neutral tones where fear learned to wear civility. She arrived early, took a seat near the aisle, and watched neighbors file in with guarded expressions, the familiar mix of curiosity and caution settling like dust. When Alexander Blackwood entered, there was no dramatic pause, only a quiet recognition that moved through the room as people straightened, voices lowering not from command but from instinct. He introduced himself simply, stating his name and purpose without titles, explaining that he had come to speak about stewardship, about honoring boundaries both written and unwritten, and about a promise that connected the past to the present in a way that benefited everyone. He spoke of Thomas Carter not as a legend, but as a neighbor who had chosen decency when no one was watching, and he framed that choice as a standard worth protecting, a reminder that communities thrived when they safeguarded the quiet good alongside the visible rules. Emily felt the room shift as skepticism gave way to consideration, as people realized they were being asked to rise rather than retreat. Questions followed, measured and practical, about safety, about rumors, about what presence meant moving forward, and Alexander answered with patience, emphasizing that protection did not mean disruption, that watchfulness could exist without spectacle, and that respect for the dead often taught the living how to behave better. When someone suggested relocating attention elsewhere, he declined gently, saying that memory was not something to be managed away, and that acknowledging a debt strengthened trust rather than weakened it. Then he turned toward Emily, not isolating her, but placing her within the circle of community, and stated clearly that her father's grave would remain undisturbed, that any stewardship would be conducted openly, and that no one would be singled out for curiosity or blame. The words were precise, calm, and irrevocable, and Emily understood that this was the repayment made visible, not a claim over her life but a shield around her right to live it plainly. As the meeting concluded, people lingered, conversation softer, a few nods offered her way that carried apology without demanding forgiveness. Outside, the evening air felt lighter, and Alexander walked with Emily to the steps, telling her that choices made in daylight lasted longer than those forced in shadow, and that she had done well by standing steady without asking to be saved. She replied that her father had taught her to trust quiet work, and he smiled, acknowledging the lineage without turning it into burden. As he departed, the town resumed its rhythm, doors closing, engines starting, the ordinary reclaiming its place, and Emily stood for a moment, feeling the truth settle, that destiny did not always arrive as thunder. Sometimes it arrived as agreement, as a room full of people choosing better because someone had reminded them how. She walked home with a sense of alignment she had never known, aware that the debt had been repaid not only to her father, but to the place itself, and that whatever unfolded next would do so on ground made honest by witness and restraint. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt earned rather than imposed, and Emily noticed how small assurances began to accumulate: a nod from the clerk at the hardware store, a neighbor returning a borrowed ladder without being asked, the subtle easing that came when people felt watched over without feeling watched. One afternoon, Alexander invited her to walk the perimeter near the cemetery, not as a patrol, but as a lesson in boundaries, explaining how places carried memory the way people did, shaped by what was protected and what was ignored. He pointed out old fence posts weathered to silver, stones stacked by hands long gone, the way paths formed where feet returned with purpose, and Emily listened, recognizing the language of care her father had spoken fluently without naming it. As they walked, she asked the question that had waited patiently at the edge of her thoughts, not about power or wolves, but about why her father had been found when so many acts of kindness vanished into silence. Alexander answered with candor, saying that some deaths were tracked not by ledgers but by witness, that he had been looking for a man who chose mercy without leverage, and that such men were rare precisely because they did not announce themselves. He told her that the night her father helped him, the choice had altered a trajectory that could not be measured in miles or years, and that remembering it was a responsibility, not a favor. Emily absorbed this without awe, understanding that responsibility felt familiar, that she had carried it since her father died. Only now it was shared. At the edge of the clearing, they paused, the forest breathing around them, and Alexander spoke about thresholds, about how protection changed shape when trust was established, shifting from presence to partnership. He said that if she wished, there would come a time when her voice could speak alongside his, not to claim authority but to anchor it, ensuring that promises remained accountable to the people they served. Emily did not answer immediately, considering the weight of being seen and the freedom of choosing when to step forward, and Alexander respected the silence, knowing that consent mattered more than speed. As the sun lowered, a single white wolf appeared at the tree-line, watching without crossing the line, and Emily felt the old circle echo again, not enclosing but acknowledging. Alexander explained that witness did not always mean proximity, that sometimes it meant distance held with intention, and that trust allowed for both. When they parted, he reminded her that doors opened by honesty required maintenance, and that she would never be asked to become something she was not. That night, Emily returned to her apartment and sorted through her father's old toolbox, touching the worn handles, the measured labels, finding comfort in tools designed to fix rather than impress. She realized that the debt repaid had become a covenant, quiet and durable, and that her role was not to carry it alone but to live in a way that honored its terms. As she set the tools back in place, she felt the steady certainty that the next step would arrive when it was ready, and that when it did, she would meet it with the same restraint and resolve that had guided her father, confident that the circle held, not to confine her, but to keep the ground honest beneath her feet. The choice became visible in a way Emily could not ignore when Alexander invited her to attend a small dedication at the cemetery, framed not as ceremony but as maintenance, a practical gathering to install a modest marker explaining the site's preservation, its language clear and measured, its intent grounded in respect. She arrived early, carrying a thermos and a folded list of names her father had once helped, people who had drifted through his life without fanfare, and she placed the paper in her pocket as a reminder that memory worked best when anchored to facts. Neighbors arrived in ones and twos, the town's easy cadence intact, and when Alexander stepped forward, he did so without elevation, standing on the same ground, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard. He spoke about stewardship as a shared task, about how places became safer when responsibility was distributed rather than hoarded, and about how honoring one life could steady many. Then he invited Emily to speak if she wished, making the offer once and leaving it there, and she felt the weight of the moment settle without pressure. She took a breath and spoke plainly, thanking those who had respected the boundaries, acknowledging the curiosity without feeding it, and naming her father as a man who believed that doing right did not require an audience. Her voice held because it was hers, because she was not asking for permission, and the listening that met her words felt honest. When she finished, Alexander affirmed the protection in terms that were precise and public, stating that the site would remain preserved, that access would be respectful, and that no one would be singled out or sensationalized. And he said this not as decree but as agreement, witnessed and recorded. The effect was immediate and calm, a settling rather than a stir, and Emily understood that this was recognition without spectacle, the kind that lasted. As the gathering dispersed, a white wolf appeared at a distance, visible enough to be acknowledged, distant enough to remain choice rather than command, and people noticed without fear, accepting presence as part of the landscape rather than an interruption. Alexander met Emily's gaze and inclined his head, a gesture that said the debt had been repaid in full and transformed into something ongoing, and he told her that if she wished to step forward more fully in time, the door would remain open, unlatched and unguarded. She replied that she would consider it, appreciating that consideration was treated as strength. Later, as she walked the path alone, the air felt balanced, the ground firm, and she realized that protection had taken its truest form, not a shield held over her, but a structure built around her rights. That evening, she returned home and set the list of names on the table, adding one more at the bottom, her own, not out of pride but out of clarity, understanding that belonging was not granted but practiced. As dusk folded into night, she sensed the circle once more, wider and quieter than before, and she felt ready for what came next, knowing that the path ahead would ask for steadiness, witness, and consent, and that she had all three. The morning after the dedication, Emily returned to the cemetery alone, not because she needed reassurance, but because routine had become a way to honor what had been settled, and as she walked the path, she noticed how the place felt complete without feeling closed. She knelt by the headstone and spoke softly, telling her father that the promises made had been kept with care, that the town had chosen steadiness over spectacle, and that his quiet way of living had outlasted the noise that followed him. When she stood, a familiar presence waited at the edge of the clearing, Alexander Blackwood leaning against a weathered fence post, not intruding, simply there, and he greeted her with the ease of someone who knew when to arrive without announcement. They walked together for a time, speaking of ordinary things, of work schedules and weather patterns, of how responsibility found its place when people agreed to hold it. And then he paused, turning toward her with a gravity that felt neither urgent nor heavy. He told her that the debt he had repaid had reached its natural end, that protection would remain but that obligation would not, and that what came next, if anything, would be chosen freely by both of them. Emily appreciated the clarity, understanding that endings mattered as much as beginnings, and she asked him what he intended to do now that the promise was fulfilled. Alexander answered that he would continue his work, watching for the quiet choices that shaped outcomes, tending to boundaries that kept communities honest, and that he would remember Thomas Carter as a measure, a reminder that strength without humility did not endure. As they reached the gate, a single white wolf appeared again at a distance, acknowledging the moment with stillness before turning back toward the trees, and Emily felt a sense of completion settle, not as loss but as balance restored. Alexander offered his hand, not as claim but as respect, and she took it, feeling the warmth of a connection grounded in consent rather than fate. He said that doors would remain open should she wish to walk through them later, and she replied that she would live well where she stood, trusting that paths revealed themselves when walked honestly. When he departed, the town resumed its gentle rhythm, and Emily returned home with a lightness she had not expected, understanding that recognition had not changed who she was, but had allowed her to be fully herself without defense. In the weeks that followed, life continued with an ease that felt earned, the feed store steady, the cemetery quiet, the whispers fading into respect, and Emily found satisfaction in the ordinary, knowing that justice had been served without fanfare. One evening, as the sun set and the forest caught the light just so, she felt the presence of the circle again, wide and unobtrusive, and she smiled, realizing that true strength did not bind or claim, it witnessed, and then stepped back. She set a small stone at the grave, a habit her father had taught her, and walked away with confidence, carrying forward a story that had been honored and released, ready to meet whatever came next with dignity intact and ground firm beneath her feet.